Hi there and welcome to the Tomorrow's Future Today online conference. Well, firstly, it's a real privilege to be presenting here at this conference. I remember having seen the 2013 Tomorrow's Future Today conferences. I resolved to try to get involved more with the next one because it's a really wonderful thing, and as a result, it's a great privilege to be involved. I'd also like to comment on the excellent session before me. I'd like to thank Corinne Jones for her presentation on virtual teams around the globe, particularly for myself as the UK member of a very global product team. So much of that rang true, so I think it was a really excellent presentation. In the interest of transparency, this is actually a re-recording right after my live presentation. We had some trouble with the slides, and we wanted to make sure that there was a version of this up on the archive which had no issues. So today we're going to look at a big trend that's driving out of a number of consumer tools. We're seeing tools like Uber, TripAdvisor and Yelp really become dominant, or at least challenge the status quo in their industries. They're attacking a system of trust in each case that has been quite long established and has always been quite a beneficial and benevolent means of providing information and assurance to people. But now these tools are taking on those models with quite dramatic results. So we're going to see how this is causing conflict. We're going to see how this is actually disrupting whole industries, potentially out of existence. And also how it's benefiting some types of provider over others in particular industries. We're also going to see evidence that IT is already being impacted by some of these trends. And finally, we'll take a look at what lessons we can derive from that fact, but also think about how we might be able to benefit from it. Firstly, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Jon Hall. I've worked in IT service management pretty much my whole career, having started as a graduate trainee here at the Yellow Pages in the UK, the classified directory, which was certainly at the time a real ITIL early adopter. It was a very lucky place for me to be. Today I work as a product manager in the R&D business unit of BMC Software. I've been there since 2008. And my focus is really on driving ITSM tools forward to meet the evolving needs of our customers and of the practitioners and professionals out there in the market. I live in Reading in the UK and I've been here as well over a decade now. So while I'm part of a more global team, my base is Europe, and I often gives me a chance to get face to face with European customers and really sort of hear about some of these things firsthand from them as well. So firstly, we're going to look at Uber. And if you're familiar with Uber, you'll already know that it's essentially a taxi and limousine ride booking service. So it's not doing anything fundamentally new, but what Uber is doing is delivering this in a different way. It's an application that I can download onto my telephone, onto my smartphone, and with that application I can see which drivers are available near to me to offer me taxi services at different levels of quality. And as we'll see in a moment, I can also learn quite a lot about those individuals themselves and the service they've already provided to other people. Now, one of the things that Uber is doing is it's really taking on a highly regulated market. So taxi regulation, I think generally, again, it's hard to argue that it's not been a good thing. It's there for our safety. It's very much something that's been designed to ensure that we don't get into an unlicensed or uninsured taxi, and that the people who are driving us around are, going to work in our interests and not threaten us or, potentially be violent or criminal. So yeah, that's all very good. And as a result, it's not really a surprise that as Uber has started to emerge in cities, particularly in North America, they've been taken on pretty hard by the existing regulators and by the customers of those regulators. And what's interesting about these systems of regulation, when we take a look at them, two things are very interesting. Firstly, these systems, they do exist to grant a level of trust, but it's sort of based on the paradigm that there should be a minimum acceptable standard. So here is an example that we're looking at now with the New York Taxi Code, which looks to, defines itself as having a role of setting and enforcing standards and conditions. And we see the same thing right over the world. So just taking one other example, this is the most recent Taxi Regulation Act in the Republic of Ireland. And here, it makes the statement that a key purpose of these regulations is to regulate the conduct and behavior and even the appearance of the drivers and their vehicles. And the second thing about this, quite amusingly, is that this goes back a very long way. The original and first taxi regulator, as far as I can see, was Oliver Cromwell in London, who, again, looked to define a standard of conduct that would give people the trust that taxis met a certain service. But I think what we have to emphasize here is this is about defining minimum standards. We can still get into a scruffy taxi. I mean, anybody who's taken a taxi in most big cities will know that these standards don't guarantee real excellent cleanliness and service. They just guarantee an amount of service, and this is what Uber is taking on. So Uber, they still certainly aim to do some of those important safety checks and balances, and Uber will certainly tell you that they look to validate insurance and look to validate the driver's standards and their character, but they don't really make a big deal of that on their website. What Uber do to market themselves is to position feedback as a really key part of the experience. So that feedback becomes the brand almost. If we look at Evans here, when we look at the Uber website, Evans is in the bottom right is stated as an ex-military serviceman who runs his own business in Boston using Uber. He's expanding that business, but importantly, his personal rating is 4.8 stars out of 5. So we actually end up with a different type of trust. Rather than knowing that this driver is going to meet certain standards or we can report them to the regulator, we can actually build a pretty confident opinion of this driver from the fact that previous customers have rated them so highly. So what we're looking at here with the combination of this feedback model of trust plus the much more integrated service delivery is a real contrast to the old way of doing things. Previously I would call a taxi and I don't really know who's coming, or if I hail a taxi in the street, I just get whichever one happens to come past and stop for me first. I know very little about that driver potentially. With Uber, I can see where they are, and I get an idea of who they are and what their rating is, so that I already know more. We used to joke when I lived in the town of Slough in the UK, which is by British standards is a pretty sprawling town, and we became quite dependent on taxis. My friends and I used to joke that we would phone these companies and then for the next half hour they would lie to us. And the taxi seemed to spend an awful lot of time just approaching the end of your road, sir. Whereas with Uber, there's no doubt. I can see where it is. I can open up my smartphone and see exactly what the location of that car is and get a pretty accurate view of when they're coming. And as a result, I also get a much more integrated experience because not only can I hail and request and understand and link up with that service, I can also pay them through the service. I don't need to rummage around in my pockets and me being clumsy subsequently have to fish out coins from down the back of the seat in the car. The whole payment system is automated through the product, including the tip. I also kind of feel more ownership of what I'm doing. As I say, I don't know who's coming. I don't know who I'm hailing. Whereas if I'm using Uber, I can choose which of the nearby cars I want. I can maybe use my own judgment and feel a bit more ownership over that decision. Perhaps I know that although one driver's nearer, there's going to be a lot of traffic in that direction, so I might get the person who's on the quiet side streets, even though they're half a mile further away. But then finally, this big thing about trust is probably the key difference. Rather than being accountable to a distant regulator who is, as far as I'm concerned, is pretty faceless and has just set a basic standard, the driver I'm going to be using with Uber or with services like it is directly accountable to me. That they're as good as the rating I give them, and As a result, you hear stories of Uber drivers treating customers pretty well. They'll hand a bottle of water over. They'll do whatever they can to ensure that you give them a 5-star rating, because their brand is not a regulator's license plate on the back of the car. It's that star rating that we're giving them. So feedback is a really big deal for a company like this. When we look at another example, TripAdvisor, we see a feedback-driven site that's doing more than just conflicting with the existing trust framework. It's almost putting its existence at risk. Now, I'm a big fan, as it happens, of the Lonely Planet travel guide series. It almost seems a shame to be talking about them in the way I will. And behind me on my shelves, I have a rack of about 20 of these, some of them for places I did go to. Often we just got a whim to go somewhere, and it was interesting to buy the book and read through these books. And Lonely Planet was, and still is to some extent, a significant provider of trust and information. At one point, as you see here, back in 2005, they were selling 6 million books a year, and that was massive. I mean, that made them the biggest publisher in the world of travel guides. In 2007, the British Broadcasting Corporation bought them for a then undisclosed sum. We'll come to the numbers in a moment. And if you look at the news article here at the time, it stated that at the time, as well as selling these sort of 6 million books, the website of Lonely Planet was getting 4.3 million visitors a month, which sounds pretty good, but keep that figure in mind. Because we move on a few years to last year, to 2013. And then the reports look kind of different. So last year, BBC Worldwide actually sold their stake in Lonely Planet, and it turned out that they bought them for 130 million British pounds and sold them at a loss of nearly 80 million British pounds. So, that's destroyed, it's equivalent to about 130 million US dollars. I was presenting the Asian time zone, so this in Indian rupee terms, it's 800 crore, 8 billion Indian rupees. They lost a lot of money on this deal, but that really isn't a surprise when we look back with hindsight, because around about the time that Lonely Planet was purchased, the guidebook market had been pretty strong, and there were big sales. But Nielsen Bookscan, who produced this analysis, they've been projecting a really serious decline, and actually the results have followed that. So if we look at what they're projecting here, it's almost a decline to zero if we follow this trend, and the real life trend is following it. And one of the biggest disruptors of this market, I think it's undoubtable to say, has been the rise of TripAdvisor. Interestingly, we're talking about trust here today. TripAdvisor clearly see themselves as a provider of trust. They have trademarked this phrase, the world's most trusted travel advice. Meanwhile, as well, over the similar timescale to the one in which the BBC was losing so much money on Lonely Planet, TripAdvisor has just exploded. I mean, it has become an enormous revenue generator. It is getting huge amounts of hits, and it's growing rapidly still. So over the last year, this is the quarter four and annual report from just last week, their traffic has been growing 50% year on year. And they're claiming 2 billion unique visitors last year in 2013, which suddenly makes that Lonely Planet figure of 4.3 million visitors look pretty tiny. So when we compare, where we were in the old trust system to where we are now, there are a lot of big differences and a lot of advantages to TripAdvisor, unfortunately, for the old book format. I say I like travel books, but they're sitting on my shelf, and the data isn't getting any fresher. So if a travel book happens to be a few years old, I start to lose trust in that information. It might recommend a good restaurant, but I don't know if over the course of a few years that restaurant has changed ownership or has shut down, or even that I'm not missing something really great just around the corner. For TripAdvisor, I'm getting that information pretty fresh. There's constant reviews going on. So if a restaurant suddenly turns bad, or if a new attraction opens, I'm going to see that because the data is the latest. Guidebooks always had the issue that they couldn't cover everything. So if we look in this photo, the book on the right in the rack is a book on Germany. Germany's quite, it's a big place, but here it's been condensed to 500 pages. And while there can be, best efforts around the things that a 500-page book can cover in a country that size, it's never going to catch everything. I've worked away a lot in my career, often, having those days by myself in hotels, and I'm sure a lot of us on this, a lot of this, the audience will be aware, it's not as glamorous sometimes as our friends and relatives think it is, because we always end up with those evenings sitting in a restaurant by ourselves reading a book. But at least we can look for a decent restaurant, right? Now, the trouble with a guidebook is illustrated neatly by a fact I found about the Zagat restaurant guides for Los Angeles, in which it was estimated that they only had 5% coverage of the LA restaurant market. So, there is a 1 in 20 chance, effectively, all other things being even, that a particular restaurant I might be interested in or nearby to is even featured in the guidebook. Again, for TripAdvisor, that's no problem, because they can add as many things as they want. It's dynamic and live data, and there's no constraint in terms of pages. So when I'm working away, I can be pretty confident that most places I might want to eat, I'll be able to get some pretty useful information on. Lonely Planet changes, the Lonely Planet trust model, it was based on the opinions of experts, a few experts. That's not necessarily a bad thing, and actually the way most of these travel guides worked is to, take feedback from some of their trusted friends and correspondents and act as curators of that feedback. They may not visit every single place on an individual basis. But TripAdvisor goes completely the other way. If we look at the top attraction here listed for Bristol, which is a very nice city not far from where I live in the UK, we like visiting there. The top attraction in Bristol has been rated by 206 people in this example. So rather than getting one person's view, which, do I trust them, or do I think they could be, subjective, or could they have just got a bad day at a restaurant? Or could they have got an unusually good day at a restaurant? I can pretty much work out from 200 plus reviews what kind of experience I'm likely to get. I have a lot more confidence and trust in that. Even though there can be more noise than signal sometimes, it's still quite straightforward, I think, to a practiced consumer of this feedback to work out, what are the trustworthy reviews. And that's actually bolstered by sites like TripAdvisor and Amazon, where they even let you review the reviewer by saying which are the most useful reviews, and that helps them to push the best content to the top. It really enriches an already broad set of data. And then finally, the delivery mechanism. Like Uber gives us this very kind of graphical, contextual, informed view of where our taxis are. Likewise, TripAdvisor does something that a book can't. So if I'm sitting in a hotel, I'm in an unfamiliar place, a guidebook, it's still useful, but I probably have to find a map. I have to work out where the hotel is. I need to work out where the restaurant is. I then have to figure out how to get there. With TripAdvisor, I can simply say, for example, tell me all the Mexican restaurants within a mile of me, or 2 miles of me, or whatever. Perhaps I can then filter by the rating. I'm interested in 3 stars or higher. Just show me where they all are, and then when I find one I want, it navigates me straight to it. So it takes a lot of the friction out of the process, and it just makes life easy. And all these things, there's an undoubtable disruption that this is causing. This is more serious than conflict. This really is threatening a whole sector of travel advice, trust provision that has been with us again for a very long time. That the guidebook is a very old thing, and its days are numbered. Now we're going to look at another consumer site along the same lines, which is Yelp.com, another kind of very open and broad review site which enables consumers to review all manner of services and products and hospitality businesses. Now Yelp is interesting in that it was studied in some depth by Harvard Business School a few years ago, back in 2011, in a widely quoted research study called Reviews, Reputation and Revenue. And one of the key conclusions, one of the most interesting conclusions I think from that presentation, was the fact that Yelp has a really decent effect on the performance of independent businesses. So if you're a restaurant, and I think this was a very United States focused study, but Yelp is everywhere. The model doesn't change. I think it's probably fair that this effect goes wider. A 1-star increase in your rating gives you between a 5 and 9% revenue increase as an independent chain. And on the kind of margins these businesses operate on, that's actually potentially a big uptick in profitability. That's not, it's not as small as it might sound. But interestingly, the same effect really doesn't exist for the branded chains. They found almost no difference made by increased ratings to a brand restaurant. And what they suggested, I think very correctly, that this shows is that the chain affiliation of a restaurant, that familiar brand name, whether it's a global or national chain, that's actually sort of been a way of trusting the service. We probably find that if we go to a branded restaurant, we're not going to get the best restaurant in town, even at the price. But we're going to get something that we can predict and understand. A brand name pizza chain, we've probably eaten the same food in different cities and even different countries. We know kind of what we're getting. We're unlikely to get a bad meal because those brands at least protect their minimum standards pretty well. But what we might miss out on is something really cool. Some independent place that for the same amount of money we could get something a bit special and memorable. One of the barriers to trying to do that before in unfamiliar places is if we have no word of mouth recommendation, if we have no real knowledge of the best providers, we're almost judging the book by its cover. That was all we had. We could look at the restaurant and try and figure out if it was good. And most of us have those techniques like, does it look like there are locals eating there? That's probably a good sign. Well, now we don't have that uncertainty because these sites like Yelp and TripAdvisor are giving us a really nicely structured view of other people's reviews of those sites. It helps us to leap a hurdle that was previously there, in which a branded restaurant gave us assurance that an independent didn't. So it's interesting, I think, this effect, because again we're seeing an incumbent means of trust provision, this branding, being eroded by a better informed set of consumers due to these services. And the question I think we need to ask as an IT organization, each of us, is our IT department, are we that kind of open and trusted service provider because people are really confident in us because they know what we're doing? Or are we just acting as the taxi regulator or the branded chain? Are we just relying on people having to trust us because that's where we are? So we've talked about the data, this feedback data, and how it really, is changing expectations and changing trust. I want to tell a story, a very recent story, which gives a good example of just how much consumers feel that they own and are entitled to this data. And this is a story of a product called Course Table. Now Course Table was written by some students at Yale University in the United States. And I want to give a bit of background on Yale. I mean, it's a very prestigious university, and I'm assuming it comes with tuition fees to match that for most people. Yale's ethos has always been that students should take a wide variety of courses, a good number of courses. So Yale provides tools for students to plan and investigate different classes that they might want to take. Now, Yale also collects feedback from students on their experience in each class, but at no point had they ever thought to put those things together. They were quite protective, in fact, of the feedback data. It was never really intended, as far as they were concerned, to be amalgamated. But of course, students, if you're planning your education, if you're paying a lot of money, you want to be sure that you can trust you're going to get a good quality. You want to be confident you're going to be happy. And so 2 students at Yale identified an opportunity to build a product that would pull that data in, pull that feedback data in, and provide students with an alternative course planning guide that incorporated review data so that they knew how highly people had rated the classes they were thinking of taking at a glance. And they can sort by it and filter by it and do all those things that people expect to do with this kind of information. They also did a really good job of incorporating some nice social features. So if I wanted to know which of my Facebook contacts had perhaps looked at a course I was also looking at, I can see that again right in front of me. And I can also view my friends' entire planning worksheets so that I get an idea of what perhaps the friends I might want to study with have set out as their course schedule. So I don't know about you, but I think this is pretty cool. And I think that a university, you might expect, would congratulate their students on building a clever product and doing a good job. The reality was very different. So last month, this broke as a pretty big news story in the United States. Rather than encourage this or help students to use it, and this was pretty popular. 2,000 plus out of 5,000 students were using this alternative course table tool, and so Yale made the decision to block it. And to add insult to injury, they blocked it with a message that implied that there was malicious activity on the Yale networks. Now, I don't think they quite foresaw just how viral this was going to get. It turned into a very big news story with petitions being raised with a huge number of signatures and Facebook groups and Twitter campaigns. Students saw this as a real assault on their freedom to consume public data in the way they wanted to. It's an attack on freedom of speech as far as the consumer was concerned. So, after a bit of a media storm, Yale retracted, and eventually a kind of compromise was found that enabled this data to be used. There was an interesting story in this article from Bloomberg from a few weeks ago, in which the dean of students of Yale conceded that they underestimated the speed that technology had moved on, but also the sense of ownership of data. The questions of who owns data are evolving before our very eyes, in the words of the dean of students. And again, that's pretty profound. This is a new generation of people who will not, in not too many years, be a significant part of our workforce. And, in this case, the university is having to accept that if that data is there, they want to see it. So I thought it was an interesting story, and I looked a little wider and found that, I think the idea of students becoming more and more, acting more and more as consumers is probably no surprise. We here in the UK, tuition fees have kind of gone from zero to almost 10,000 British pounds in the space of a few years, and that's per year. So it's quite a lot of money. And certainly when I talk to people in academic IT here in the UK, there's a very strong sense that there's much more expectation on a good service. So this site Niche is a site in the United States in which students review the universities they're at, but also not just the courses they're taking or the general experience of being a student there. It goes into quite a lot of details, including the computers that are provided to them. So this is the review for Stanford University, and they're right in the heart of Silicon Valley, of course. You kind of hope that Stanford would be pretty good for IT. And it turns out they absolutely sweep it. They're first in 3 out of 4 of the categories against thousands of universities. They get an A+ rating from their own students. And that's pretty powerful. I mean, this is something that is out there in public. It's almost a shop window for the university. But there's bad examples too. This is a Yelp review from a really big US university, and it just savages the IT department. The overall rating for the university as a result is just 2 stars. And again, this is a competitive marketplace. This information's right out there. And so this is consumers acting in the same way that they do for restaurants and hotels and all those other things on the travel sites. But they're doing it for their own college faculties. And this stuff shows up pretty prominently on Google searches. Prospective students are likely to see this. But this is interesting because it made me think, how much of this is already going on in the world of business, and in particular to IT. And it didn't take long to to stumble upon these reviews on the Glassdoor website. So Glassdoor, effectively, it's a site which, if you are thinking of going to work for a company, you can view reviews of that company from people who already work there. Again, very public data. You don't really need to sign up to get this. It's all publicly available and Google indexed, which of course means it's also there for your customers. And these are some examples where non-IT employees in large companies, large household name companies, have really savaged their IT department and talked about the problems that IT gives them in just doing their job. So I guess we need to ask ourselves, is our department already being rated in this way by the people that interact with us? And is that stuff right out there in public for our prospective hires and for our customers to see? And I think the answer in many cases is yes. Now this is just one consumer trend that's really significantly changing expectations of IT and the way, the reality of our day-to-day existence as an industry. And we see a lot of other big consumer trends, and a lot of these are quite familiar. There's a lot of material, a lot of presentations in this conference itself will no doubt talk about these trends. So in the top one here we see Evernote, another consumer originating tool with a lot of those sort of features that people have come to expect. I like using Evernote as an example of how mobility is developing in business, because Evernote, it isn't really a mobile tool or a desktop tool or a web tool. It's just Evernote, and it doesn't matter whether I'm holding one of my two smartphones or my tablet or my laptop. I can get the same data really seamlessly. And Evernote has really crept into businesses in a big way. It's almost gone viral. So they realized they probably needed to launch a business-focused service. And when they launched it, the CEO of Evernote conceded that most of their business users, the vast majority, weren't really using it under the guidance and permission of their own IT departments. It had just got in there whether the IT department liked it or not. Secondly, of course, the bring your own device trend. There are so many articles and words and facts about this out there that I won't go into much detail, but again, given I was presenting this in the Asia time slot, I was interested to just verify that it's as big a trend in those regions as it is anywhere else. And of course it is. If anything, it's bigger. This number, 83% of employees bringing their own device to work, that's kind of that's high normal. It's pretty standard, and depending on how you measure it, you'll see similar numbers, I think, in most places in the world. But what was really interesting in this study, which was by VMware last year, focused on the Asia Pacific Japanese region, 41%, a big number of the people bringing their own device to work, were actually citing the fact that they needed it for better contactability for their clients. So this almost seems to be implying this isn't just bring your own device because people want to use their own device for their own work. It's actually giving them the means to contact their clients when perhaps that's not fully provided by their business. And that's something we really need to think about and look into. And then thirdly, just generally there is a perception gap between IT's view of itself and increasingly what our customers think of us. So last year, BMC commissioned a big study from Forrester, and Forrester went out and spoke to a large number of both business users and IT people, nearly 1,000 of each. And some of the numbers that came out of that study were pretty horrifying, actually. A large percentage of people reported, double figures of hours lost per month to IT problems. And the majority of users are feeling what they define as a severe or moderate impact on their own job as a result of IT. So that kind of reflects some of the things we saw in those Glassdoor reviews, and that people telling us that IT is not helping them, it's actually getting in the way. We saw in this study that there's typically a 15 percentage point gap between the IT's expectation of its own customer satisfaction score and the customer's real view of IT. Now, this doesn't just come down to the issue of consumerization. There are potentially a lot of technical and performance issues behind this too. But one of the big trends when we talk to end users is that they want to be able to. They've got seriously good hardware that they own these days. They want to be able to use it to do their job. And often IT is perceived as getting in the way. Now again, IT is probably feels and is probably mostly correct in thinking that in some ways it does need to be in the way. We have to ask who is responsible for major outages, because if IT carries the can when a critical supplier of perhaps a cloud project management service goes bankrupt and takes company data with it, or if there's a leakage like some of the big high profile data leakages we see and customer privacy is impacted, if IT has to carry the can for that, then IT has to assert some sort of control over what goes on. But what I think we need to do is ask some very searching questions about where that balance point is, so that we're not just acting as the taxi regulator or the old guidebook and being perceived as anachronistic as a result. So there are some real positive lessons, though, we can take from that, in finding that balance. And one of the big lessons I think we should look at is the actual success of feedback models in improving and improving service and making stuff better. I found this interesting Uber review on Yelp. So this is going a bit meta, I realize, but this is not really a customer review of Uber. It's from a driver. And it emphasized the fact that when this driver started with Uber, they were struggling to actually keep their rating high. And Uber worked with them to improve that. They focused on the feedback. They gave them constructive suggestions. And as it says here, they stuck with them. And it pushed their Uber rating up to a very high level. So this touches on the point that Uber rating is both the brand for the driver, but also for Uber. And high scores are going to build trust in both the individual provider and the framework within which they're providing that service. There's an interesting fact about TripAdvisor, who have allowed management responses to customer reviews for quite a long time. So if I post a bad review of a hotel, management can potentially respond to that. But the level at which management are doing this or embracing this concept is just absolutely soaring, more than doubling year over year. And we're seeing examples out there of companies achieving really great results by engaging with negative feedback and doing something about it. So this is a really good example of a hotel in Anaheim. Now this hotel was ranked 80th out of about 110 hotels in Anaheim. And I'm not sure about you, but that is enough to be a big warning sign for me. If a hotel is that far down the rankings, I'm going to start looking for other hotels if I have the choice. So the manager of this hotel has talked about how they embraced all sorts of detail in the feedback. They did things like they made their internet access free when previously it had been charged. And I love this quote where they even decided to change from a non-brand breakfast cereal to a branded one. And they felt that actually in doing so they got a noticeable and decent result. And now this hotel has pulled itself up to 23rd out of 111. This is a very recent score. I pulled this just the other day. They've also got a certificate of excellence from TripAdvisor. So 23rd, it's still not, it's still not in the top handful of hotels in the area, but then often most of those hotels are extremely expensive, and those of us who travel on business on realistic budgets are often playing in this kind of, upper 20th percentile. This is a good result. 23rd out of 11 wouldn't scare me. Out of 111 certainly wouldn't scare me. 80th out of 111, I'd be worried. So what they've demonstrated is that this is a really powerful tool to generate process improvement. We can go beyond the feedback, of course, when we look at consumerization. This example is Amazon. And Amazon are very notable for the fact that you can review pretty much everything in Amazon. You can view reviews of products. You can view reviews of the reviewers because they have a very strong system of promoting what people feel are the best reviews. But Amazon, interestingly, in a retail sense, does what a lot of IT departments are finding themselves having to do, which is to become this broker of different services. We're no longer a monolithic service provider in many cases. We're actually providing the central point of contact and control, perhaps, but actually we're bringing together different suppliers, different services. Now that the left-hand column here, of course, shows this is price comparison. This book happens to be my favorite novel. If I wanted to buy it on Amazon, I can buy it directly from Amazon here, as you see, for £6.29. But I could also choose other options. There's a cheaper option there, slightly cheaper option, which could give me, potentially, a lower price. And this echoes what a lot of people thought when we go back to the early days of internet retail was going to be a really big industry, which is price comparison sites. There's plenty of analysis from the early 2000s which suggests that price comparison sites were going to be the big thing in internet retail. And I would argue that they haven't been. And again, it's down to trust. People would rather actually shop with a brand they trust in many cases than with whatever is the absolute cheapest if they're not familiar with that supplier. So right side by side with the price comparison on Amazon's marketplace, it is something to establish trust in that supplier. That this cheapest supplier has got 96% positive ratings, which actually means 1 in 25 customers had a bad experience. So it gives us perhaps an incentive to drill in and see a little more about that, and again understand more about who's reviewing. And this whole detailed web of feedback through Amazon is very valuable to customers. Well, one other thing we've talked about here already when we look at Uber and we look at TripAdvisor is that contextual support. Giving me the information and the services I need when I happen to be in a position to consume them. And I could have used all sorts of examples from the innovative consumer and business space here. I mean, Google Now was something that came to mind, which I use a lot on my Android phone because it kind of learns who I am and where I am and suggests things that might be useful to me. But I thought I'd use this example because it's actually from an industry that's not really considered very tech, which is just local transport. And this is the number 17 bus in Reading. Reading is a big IT town, so the number 17 bus happens to be Wi-Fi enabled, which is pretty cool. But Reading is also a big commuter town for London. And so one fact about the number 17 bus is that it runs very close to Reading's railway station. Now this screen is usually just an advertisement screen, local businesses and services, and to be honest, usually I kind of ignore it. But one thing that I would be doing, getting off the bus and walking the few hundred meters to the train station, would be to maybe get my phone out and look at the current departure times of trains. It's the kind of town where there are so many trains to London that you don't look at the timetable, you sort of get there and work it out from there. So what the bus is doing is, in the few minutes that we're near the railway station, it's flashing up some contextual information. It's telling me what the current state of play is. And this is a collector's item for this particular railway line because everything's on time. This isn't Photoshop, this is real, for those of you who are familiar with the line from Reading to London. But yeah, it's a great simple example of someone thinking about their customer and what their customer is doing and just making their life a little easier as a result. But one other example I think is pretty important for us to look at is the sites like IFT and Zapier. And these are simply sites that enable me to set up processes that happen when something else happens. They use public APIs of key services and enable me, like in this example perhaps, if I get a particular type of email, I might want to be sent an SMS text. Perhaps if there's a high priority item that I might want to be alerted to before I next plan to check my email. Now these tools are starting to really look at the business world, having kind of focused out of the consumery, businessy space without really ever targeting large enterprises, I'd argue. And I think this is important because obviously, we're seeing our users want to personalize and to do things their own way, and genuinely they probably get a lot of benefit from doing that because they know their jobs better than anybody. One thing about this type of service, though, is it probably could let us give them a huge range of freedoms to personalize point transactions that we would never deliver to everybody but might just be valid for them. But it also enables us to keep visibility and control over how far they can go. So if we are worried about data leakage and governance, at least we can set up a menu of options that enables people to heavily personalize within the bounds of what we need to allow them to do. And I think that kind of service in particular we really need to focus on because it's probably on that line at the right kind of balance point between complete freedom and over control. So let's sort of summarize, that what could be an effective way forward for IT. Well, I propose that we do need to adopt a number of these principles that are driving such huge change in the consumer space. So let's get away from dusty old models of periodic satisfaction surveys. We talk about customer relationship management in frameworks like ITIL, but that tends to kind of lead to a discussion on periodic data collection, or even transaction by transaction, but with ownership by the IT department, and not really an open, almost individual or team level layer of feedback. And I think this is something that, it might be quite a scary thing for IT to consider adopting, but there's two things out there that make it pretty important to consider. The first is it's becoming so ubiquitous and consumers just expect it. And the example of Yale shows what happens when monolithic organizations try to block that trend. But the other thing is just that it's also it's being shown to be a pretty powerful way of improving our services. If we're really serious about identifying and tackling the biggest customer pain points, then what better way is there to know them than to know about them immediately and openly? I think the delivery mechanisms of tools like Uber show us a really clear way forward for some of the technologies and tools we use. Right now, each IT function tends to have a relatively self-contained tool. I mean, we obviously a good enterprise ITSM tool set has really strong integration across things, but we don't have that kind of Uber experience yet necessarily in most in most organizations, at least. When you look at Uber, it's really two applications. We've talked about the customer's application, but Uber also has the drivers, and the drivers have an application that enables them to deliver the service better, and even as a sideline to rate you as a customer, which is an interesting, that you don't get to see your own customer rating, but the drivers do. But then a lot of the power in this is the integration between the two. That's what I think we need to realize about tools like Uber. We can deliver really great point tools for the customer to ask for services, for the service provider to deliver them, but a huge amount of power exists in the interaction between them. And a really brilliant example of this recently has been Amazon's Mayday button, where on the latest model of Kindle Fire, I can press a button and be connected to a video chat with an Amazon support representative almost immediately. I read recently they were averaging a 9-second response time, which is, I think, really impressive. I think we all know, that we've talked about already, and it will be talked about extensively, that this fact that IT has to start acting more as a broker of different services, especially in larger organizations. But we have to think about how to deliver that. I believe Amazon's marketplace is a really good consumer example of that. That is, actually brings a lot of small suppliers in to work right alongside and almost in competition with the big monolithic supplier. And it does it with both display of the cost of that service, but also an establishment of trust using this sort of new method of doing so. And as a result, it does the same thing that eBay feedback has done for good eBay sellers. It takes an uncertainty and makes it into confidence for the customer. So I think we need to think very hard about how we actually set out and deliver these brokered offerings. Every one of the big things that's driven almost every person on their cell phone has been personalization. You look at two different iPhones and they'll look very, very differently. And it's interesting listening to my colleague Chris Dancy talking about smartphone palmistry, reading about people's lives from the applications on their phones. And it's just one example of the rampant personalization that consumer services is letting people have. They can tailor their device to their life. And we're certainly seeing a huge trend for people to want to do the same thing with their work tools. So, let's think about how best to open it. Let's look at whether services like IFT and Zapier and similar things give us the means to allow extensive personalization without losing this final point, which is this degree of governance. IT departments need to face up to the reality that a complete end-to-end hands-on control over everything is not going to meet customer expectations. We need to give people freedom to do what they need to do, but we have to find that element of control, that right level of control, to make sure that our businesses are protected. And I'd argue that if we can do these things, then we're actually moving from that old school taxi regulator, guidebook, monopolized, and pretty much self-appointed trust provider position to really genuinely earning our trust from our customers. And I think that will really do everybody a lot of good. So I'd like to thank you for listening. Thank you again for attending this wonderful conference. You can find me on Twitter at Jon Hall with an underscore after that. It'd be really interesting to talk with you. I also write about this kind of subject and more at my blog, evolvingitsm.com. So thank you very much for your time, and enjoy the rest of the conference.